Hey team, for this first video lesson, I'm going to dive deep into how carbohydrates really affect the body. Not just in the short term, but also long term moving forward. And by the end of this video, you should have a much better understanding of how, depending on what you're eating, how it's affecting your entire day, but what we can also do to help slow down any negative aspects of the carbohydrates that we are eating as well. So strap in your seatbelts. Don't worry if you don't understand this diagram right here. I'm about to explain all of it. Deuces. Hope you enjoy. Send me a message if you want to follow up after this as well. Let me know what you think and if you have any questions, of course. So for our first lesson here, to kick this off, we're going to dive deep into how carbohydrates affect the body. Now, depending on who you talk to, again, people probably heard carbs are bad, maybe they're good, our bodies need them, they don't, ketogenic diet, whatever. Our bodies are designed to use carbohydrates. However, our body also specifically responds to carbohydrates in a very unique way that after this, once you understand that, should really be able to help provide some great information and some application of how you can take this information and use it when you're creating your own meals, when you're doing your own grocery shopping, and just for general knowledge in terms of eating and food awareness. Now, if I had to ask you, what is a carbohydrate that comes to mind when you eat? Don't worry though, before we even say that, I'll do it for you. Let's say you just had some white bread. Well, I'll just make that dot there to symbolize that. As you can see here from our graph, we have blood sugar on one side and time on the other. Now, when we eat carbohydrates, our blood sugar instantly is spiked. So let's draw a little spikage here. Now think to yourself, and it's okay if you don't understand. Now if you do get this question right, send me a message. Good for you. But I correct myself up clearly. Do you know the main hormone that is released when we eat carbohydrates? Give you a second, think on that. If your response was insulin, you would be correct. Insulin is that hormone that is released when we eat carbohydrates that lets our body know that we are. Insulin is released when we eat carbohydrates, and that's helped shuttle our blood sugar out throughout our entire body and regulate that. Now, interestingly enough, when we eat and we release insulin, what this also does, because of a huge spike in blood sugar, it basically signals to our body to store fat. Draw a little fat cloud there. Because many times when we eat carbohydrates, especially in this context, we get such a rush of blood sugar at one time. Our body's trying to disperse it and figure out what to do, but there's so much that, and oftentimes too much, that our body's like, all right, you know what I need to do with this? I need to store it. And so when insulin's released in this context, many a times our body instantly starts to store that as fat. But then what happens? Well, oftentimes, we'll get this huge rush, blood sugar, insulin, and then we will go, come on marker, and then we'll get this steep crash. It's this drop in blood sugar that we will call reactive hypoglycemia, because we get such an increase and such a severe drop at one time. This is often what will contribute to dips in energy, mood swings. That just gives a name to what that feeling would be called. But then what happens? Well, you get hungry again. And so what happens many a times in someone's diet is we end up becoming and succumbing to this vicious cycle of blood sugar dips, insulin spikes. But what happens when that what happens when this happens, excuse me, is every time we get a spike, our body signals to store fat because of that huge rush of insulin. What also happens with this over time is our body ends up becoming insulin resistant, and this is where diabetes over an extended period of time starts to develop. However, there is a way you can slow down this process when we're eating. And let's just take carbohydrates, for example. This is just introducing just a singular carbohydrate. Well, what we can do to slow this down, what do I want to use? Let's go with blue. So let's say we just had that spike. What can help stop that process? Actually, before I even get into there, the goal is to be able to have a smooth line. I'll just draw it out. A much smoother road with less bumps, well, maybe only small bumps of energy, rather than these big peaks and valleys. Now, what can help contribute to that? It's a macronutrient. I'll give you a second to think about it. We have carbohydrates as one macronutrient. It's okay. If you were thinking fat, good guess, but we're actually talking about protein. Probably we're thinking protein. It's okay. If you weren't, that's why we're here. So, let me draw an arrow. As I misspell protein, that's okay. When we eat protein, this response, in terms of how quickly the blood sugar is released, is actually reduced by 50% if we eat a carbohydrate and protein at the same time. So when it comes to making your meals, this is why this is very important to pair a carbohydrate with a protein. Now, it can also be slowed down if it's depending on what type of fat it is, as long as it's not like a refined or like fried type of fat. If you were looking more of like monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, omega-3s, healthy quote-unquote fats, if you will, I guess that would be more for maybe like a vegetarian or someone that's not vegan, that's not really into eating the majority of protein sources that exist out there. But if we're just talking, let's say, like meat and potatoes, yeah, this type of process can be slowed down just by eating protein. And this is huge because when we're talking about building our meals, when it comes to, sorry, I'm like crouching. This is huge because when it comes to building our meals, this is very important to keep in mind, and it's why it's so essential to make sure we have a very balanced aspect of our food and our diet when we're eating. So it's a process like this that we slow down and we really help to regulate. Because as you can see here, yeah, this may be simple to understand now that have kind of drawn it out. Think of how easy it really is just to go back to a well of like eating chips for the average person now, if you will. Chips, candy, whatnot, this is happening all the time. And it's really easy to talk about protein. It's easy to even say that it's probably the most glorified of macronutrients right now. But the fact of the matter is the majority of people are protein deficient in their diets, and little does the average person know that when it comes to this, that like combining protein with carbohydrates, especially if we're matching the serving sizes, that alone severely reduces the risk of not just becoming insulin resistant, of diabetes, and all sorts of other health problems that will come about from that. And most of the time though, when we're creating our meals and we're following this concept of having a protein with the carbohydrate with how we're eating, it gives us a much more fuller meal, much more dense type of meal. And then when it comes to building off that, the goal is being able to pick, no matter what time of day it is, a protein and a carbohydrate to have, to again, make sure that we're not getting those peaks and valleys with our blood sugar and continuing to have an insulin triggered response to store fat. Also, one more thing. Besides the protein, another way you can help slow this process down is eating much more fibrous carbohydrates as well. Some great options that you can throw in there. Move over here. So we got the protein. You could also go beans or lentils. We can go potatoes. Very dense. And then we can also go other things like quinoa, just as some examples. Now the difference between those, they're not just complex carbohydrates, but they also have, again, fiber in them, which makes them fibrous. And what fiber really helps do when it comes to understanding how carbohydrates affect your body as well is they're going to help slow down the digestive process, which is also going to help slow down the blood sugar response of the carbohydrates that we're eating, which is why it's super important to have fiber in your diet also. So if you can get great sources of fiber from the carbohydrates you're eating, well, this peaks and valley type of movement within your blood sugar isn't going to have to be something you entirely have to worry about nearly as much. Again, to wrap this all up, the goal is to not have the peaks and valleys of blood sugar and insulin from eating refined carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates. It's either having a mixture of complex fibrous carbohydrates and protein to be able to have this nice smooth road with maybe only a couple speed bumps with our eating habits. Hope you enjoyed this video. Again, if you have any questions, you know how to find me.